I did a segment a few years ago that was about a collection of bootleg Final Fantasy games that I had found. Okay, I say bootleg, but I mean fan-made. All of them were self-published, they were fan-made affairs, and all of them were some form of passion project or another. But we've hit an interesting stride recently. I recently got my hands on several different such games that were officially published, but with any obvious Final Fantasyisms scraped away, making them legally distinct enough to be able to be sold above the board. Fabula Ultima is one of these games, and it is easily one of my favorite games of all time for reasons that are so numerous, we'd be here for half an hour just on that topic alone. This is going to be a game I will spend a lot of time on. I was grinning ear to ear as I was skimming through it, and when I recomposed myself, I found myself grinning again at some other delight that sprang from the pages for me. With this much ground to cover, let's not waste any more time. Today, we're talking about the basics of Fabula Ultima. Let's start this off with a little disclaimer. Emanuela is a friend of mine, so there is the initial bias. The argument could be made that I'm already inclined to sing nothing but praises of this game for that reason alone. And make no mistake, I will sing this game's praises. I was elated the entire time I read the book, all 362 pages. Okay, maybe not all of it, since when I came across ability and equipment lists, sample stat blocks, and other lore bits, I skipped over those, as I am often wont to do, which most of what I skipped was lists, not lore. Which tells us there's a lot of mechanics to play around with in Fabula Ultima. It also has a lot of very nice layout touches, such as green shaded text blocks when there's a lot of text, but not as many headings, so you can easily keep track of where you're at when you're reading through the pages. And optional rules are in an orange colored box, with a specific graphic that always appears for them. Ditto the rules explanations, except with a different graphic in the color red. You know, stuff that points out whether or not you should or should not pay attention to it, and designed in such a way that you can even recognize it even if you're colorblind. And of course, these features are in addition to the bare minimum, a table of contents and an index. So it's very content rich and laid out in a way that makes it easy to digest and comprehend. With that said, let's get started with some of the basic mechanics. Dice rolls in Fabula Ultima are relatively simple. Your stats are assigned a size of a die, ranging from 6 to 12, even numbers only. You'll typically roll 2 stats, or the same stat twice, and you add the two together along with a possible modifier, and compare it to a target number. Standard RPG stuff. The number you're left with, of course, is the result. You also make a note of which of these two dice is higher. This is called the high roll. And that is pretty much the building blocks of every check you're going to make in Fabula Ultima. A list of some basic ways that checks can be used is found on page 51. There is an important permutation of this formula though: group checks. Group checks are for when characters are working together to accomplish a given task. You start by picking a leader of the task, and everybody else participating is called a supporter. You start by having all the supporters roll for their check against a target number of 10. Every supporter that succeeds, that is, gets 10 or higher, adds +1 to the leader's roll. Plus, among all the successful supporters, you add the highest bond among them to the leader's roll. Now, bonds represent different emotions that characters feel towards one another, and they consist of a combination of 3 different possible pairs of emotions, with a positive connotation and a negative connotation. The combinations are admiration or inferiority, loyalty or mistrust, and affection or hatred. In addition to being used in group checks, your character's bonds can also be used to temporarily give a bonus to their check, done so by spending a Fabula point. Which Fabula points are one of the metagame resources that makes everything in Fabula Ultima tick. The most basic uses are listed on page 97. Which includes invoking bonds to get bonuses to rolls, invoking a trait that your character has, certain skills might require you to spend one, or they can be used to alter the story in some way. Players familiar with Fate, Powered by the Apocalypse, or other more narrative-focused games will feel more at home with this last use of Fabula points. There is also a few ways to gain them, listed on page 96. And these can be summarized as whenever there's a dramatic setback, or if you don't have any at the start of a session. Worth noting, you can gain extra experience at the end of a session for every Fabula point that you've spent. So while there's no upper limit to how many you can have, hoarding them can potentially hold you back in the long run. Additionally, major enemies known as villains have a similar pool of points called Ultima points. These do not get restored, but they do offer some very similar benefits to villains that the GM is allowed to use them for. Consult page 101 for more information. We have a lot more ground to cover, so let's move on to the steps of character creation. So I said I was going to do character creation, but I lied. We're first going to start with something called world creation. And this step is actually very important to do first, since some of what happens here does come up later in character creation. Plus, this sort of thing is just fun, and it gives the players purchase in the world instead of being told to study some documents and passages about what the world is all about. World creation is fluffy stuff. There is no explicit mechanical changes that happen as a result of all this. So, grab a sheet for drawing a map and decide what the general shape of the world is, and also determine what roles magic and technology play in the world. After that comes the part where everybody should contribute at least one of the following things: one major kingdom or nation on the map, and decide a few details about that kingdom; one major historical event, be it a war between kingdoms, a major natural disaster, or some kind of cultural renaissance; one enigma or mystery, something that nobody has found the answer to yet; and one looming threat that either the world faces or may one day face. Though, if you have a player that's having trouble deciding, or just doesn't care, there's also charts for you to roll starting on page 150. With the broad strokes of the world made and painted with a few interesting details, you then move on to group creation, which is not quite as interesting of a step, but is no less meaningful. Basically, this answers the question of, what brought all the player characters together? Again, this is one of the fluffier elements, with no wrong answers besides, I don't know, or they wouldn't. There's a few good examples given, with each posing a few questions to really drive the idea home. And now we finally get to the more conventional tabletop role-playing game part of this, character creation. If you haven't figured out the pattern yet, you start with some fluffy bits. Your character's identity, which is what they see themselves as. It could help to think of this as, how would your character introduce themselves? Something like disgraced former Imperial Guard, or benevolent thieving thespian. Complete with a random chart for this, because Emanuele possibly loves these things more than I do. Then you pick their theme, which is more or less what motivates them or how they see the world. Think of it as those splash screens introducing all the characters from Final Fantasy IX. You know the ones, like how Zidane's was virtue. It's quoting, "You don't need a reason to help somebody." Suggestions for theme exist on page 158, and while it's not a chart that you can roll on with numbers, there are 10 options. I think you can figure out what to do from here if you really miss there not being a chart for this. You also pick your character's origin, which is what kingdom, city, or other locale that they come from, which can already be one of the ones you established in world creation, or something entirely new if you don't feel you have enough things scribbled onto the map. After that, you finally get to the crunchy bits. You pick 2 or 3 classes, and you get 5 levels to distribute among them. Your character level is equal to the sum of all your individual class levels. There's a total of 15 classes, some of which overlap in their function a little bit, but all of which have at least some unique abilities. This is one of those games where your character will be doing a lot of multi-classing. Having just one level in a class grants you its free benefits, and every level also grants you one skill from that class. And this next part is only important if you're starting off at a level higher than 5, or if you're a theory crafter that likes to plan out your character's progression. Otherwise, it's only relevant when your character gains levels. You're not allowed to raise any class higher than 10, which is where it maxes out and becomes a mastered class. But on the other hand, maxing out and mastering a class grants you one final, very powerful skill called a heroic skill, in addition to whatever you'd otherwise get from leveling up that class. Plus, you're only allowed to have 3 classes that are unmastered. To pick a 4th, at least one of your classes must be level 10. That said, let's move on to the next step in character creation: picking attributes. Fabula Ultima has 4 attributes: Dexterity, which is your character's hand-eye coordination; Insight, which is your character's observation, awareness, and understanding; Might, which is your physical strength and resilience; and Willpower, which is your determination and your ability to influence others. You will pick one of 3 arrays to divvy up dice sizes for each of these attributes. The arrays are Jack of all trades, which is just 1d8 for every attribute; Average, which gives you 1d10, 1d6, and 2d8s; and Specialized, which gives you 2d10s and 2d6s. From there's a little bit of sub-attributes you need to calculate. Your character's HP is equal to their character level plus their base might times 5. This is how much damage they can take before they're knocked out. Crisis is half of your character's max HP, rounded down. There are certain skills that trigger when you're in crisis. MP is your character's level plus your base willpower times 5. There are certain skills that deduct your MP in order to use them. Your character also has IP for inventory points. This starts at 6, but certain classes will raise this number for you. Different items deduct a different amount of IP whenever you use them, and some skills call for you to deduct IP as well. Defense is your character's current dexterity, and it's your ability to avoid physical damage. Magic defense is your current insight, which is your ability to resist magical damage. And your initiative is 0. Last, your character has 500 Zenit, Zenit being the in-game currency used in Fabula Ultima to buy equipment. What you should make note of is if you're coming out of D&D, only weapons and armor count as equipment. Every candle, potion, length of rope your character has is not something you need to keep track of. If it's a fairly mundane item like candles, rope, chalk, a ladder, your character would have some of it if it makes sense given their identity. And if it's something that would provide a more substantial mechanical benefit, like quickly healing, that would be covered by your inventory points. GMs, you're encouraged to add to the list of things IP can be used for if you feel the current offerings are a little sparse. Either way, you keep whatever's left over from that 500 that you spent at character creation. When you're satisfied with your equipment, you then roll 2d6 and multiply it by 10, and add that to determine how much Zenit your character has at the start of the game. And finally, you decide on your character's name and what pronouns would be used to refer to them. While I haven't actually encountered anybody who blew up about this isn't some kind of political statement. I would like to remind you of the practical use of pronouns. Let's say I have 3 characters: Rufus Xavier Sarsaparilla, Raffaella Gabriella Sarsaparilla, and Albert Andreas Armadillo. I could say Rufus Xavier Sarsaparilla used a healing spell on Raffaella Gabriella Sarsaparilla while Albert Andreas Armadillo stood guard for Rufus Xavier Sarsaparilla and Raffaella Gabriella Sarsaparilla, but I don't have to, because with pronouns I could just say he used a healing spell on her while he stood guard for them, because saying all those nouns over and over and over can really wear you down. Now, let's finish this off with making a sample character, shall we? For identity, I'm thinking a vagrant swordsman, and I'll go with perseverance for their theme, not being too worried about looming threats. And for origin, we'll say this character is from Nankaido, a southern fishing village. We'll pick 3 classes: Wayfarer at level 2, Rogue also at level 2, and Weapon Master at level 1. The skills I'll pick for these are Well-Traveled and Resourceful for Wayfarer, See You Later in Dodge from Rogue, and Counterattack from Weapon Master. Next, we pick a stat array. For this, I'm going to go with Average, and I'm going to assign Might to 6, Dexterity to 10, Insight to 8, and Willpower to 8. This gives me the derived statistics of 5 HP plus 30 from my Might, and 5 from the Weapon Master class, which makes my Crisis 20, since half of 40 is 20. I don't have any skills that use this, but I'll keep a note of this anyways. I have 45 MP since I have 8 willpower times 5 for 40 plus 5 from my level. And last, the class Wayfarer and Rogue each give me plus 2 to my IP, so I have a total of 10. Since defense, magic defense, and initiative can be affected by armor, I'm going to wait till I get my equipment to calculate those. We'll use 200 to pick out a katana. It's a martial weapon, so since we're a weapon master, we are allowed to use that, and it also takes advantage of our high dexterity. And we'll also take the combat tunic for 150, since it has a balanced improvement to our defenses. And we're going to forgo getting a shield because the katana is two-handed. We couldn't use a shield anyway. This leaves us with 150 zenit left over. And if we roll 2d6 and end up with a 2, we'll multiply that by 10, gives us 20 extra on top of that, meaning our character will start with 170 zenit. He's a little bit poor. Now we can go back and calculate the secondary attributes for our equipment. Our defense is a base of 10, but we get plus 1 from dodge and plus 1 from the combat tunic. Meanwhile, our magic defense is a base of 8 from our willpower, with another plus 1 from the combat. And finally, this character needs a name. While I could be a snot-nose and drive the point home about pronouns with a really long, stupid name, we'll just call him Mifune, and you can address him as he or him. Now, honestly, I can't sing enough praises of Fabula Ultima. If I were to sum up what makes this game great, I would say this. There's no one thing that makes it great, but all the pieces that it uses work together wonderfully. And there are so many different pieces that I couldn't easily include them in all this video. There is a whole lot more for me to go over with Fabula Ultima. Since I've noticed y'all like posting comments involving numbers, let me give you all a little math problem. If you're only allowed to have 3 unmastered classes, and each class becomes mastered at level 10, what is the highest possible level you can reach before you have 2 mastered classes? Leave your answer in the comments. With all that said, I am Aro Der Schädel, and I will see you all next time.